From beyond the galaxy's edge came the Tyranids, a seemingly endless swarm of organisms great and small, consuming everything in the way. First appearing in late M41, as time has passed more and more have arrived as part of the various Hive Fleets, and swathes of the galaxy have been burned or devoured due to their presence. But the Tyranids are a species perhaps like no other, as close to truly unified as is possible by the will of a single entity. This, whatever it is, controls the Tyranids through psychic dominion, wielding such power as to distort the warp simply by being within a few light years. No one is truly sure what it is or why it does what it does, but we do have a name for it: the Hive Mind. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. Typically in logs like this, I try to provide a history lesson on the origins or nature of the topic at hand. However, I cannot truly do that here, as the Hive Mind is, at best, difficult to explain. In fact, referring to it as a singular being or entity is probably incorrect. Imperial theory suggests that it works as I introduced it, a controller dominating the minds of the Tyranids. But the truth may be both simpler and more complex than that. No other major species in the galaxy today operates under a hive mind, which is a term not unique to the Tyranids at all. A hive mind is, if you like, a collective intelligence or consciousness generated by members of a species, a shared pool of knowledge given a measure of sentience that guides the species onwards. To the best of our understanding, this is how the Tyranid hive mind operates, with all organisms being guided or controlled by the influence of the hive mind whilst constantly providing information and data back to the collective. This in turn allows the hive mind and thus the Tyranids to adapt, making them ever more dangerous with every battle, no matter the outcome. It should be noted, however, that this is not done in the manner of advisors providing information to a ruler so that they can guide the Tyranids along. Individuals provide their sensory data subconsciously and automatically, whilst the hive mind's control is absolute for all creatures under its sway. As such, it may be more reasonable to think of the hive mind as the brain of the Tyranids as a combined organism, with each creature acting as a cell that feeds back data and receives instruction via psychic neurons. Even with that analogy, I doubt I'm doing justice to the sheer power, complexity, and presence of the hive mind, but it's as close as we can perhaps describe without being a hive mind ourselves. However, this does raise a few interesting questions about the nature of the hive mind, particularly in relation to the warp. If the connections between all Tyranids that form the hive mind are psychic, and most if not all data suggests that they are, then that means the hive mind is the creation of the entirely psychic Tyranid species. But when this happens in other non-hive mind species, such as humans and Eldari, you end up with warp entities, especially the Chaos Gods or beings like Gork and Mork. As a result, one could speculate that the hive mind is a warp entity of sorts. Perhaps it was initially simply a psychic bond between all Tyranids as they evolved or were created, which is a debate for another time, but with the warp being the warp, it reflected into the immaterium and took on a sentience all of its own. And speaking of Gork and Mork, there are subtle but present parallels between the hive mind and the power of the Wa. Both are created by their respective species and are considered by many as a gestalt consciousness, which would imply that the orcs are a hive mind of sorts that is stronger and smarter in greater numbers. To be clear, that's not what I'm saying is true. The orcs are far too individualistic for that. I'm merely pointing out the similarities. In fact, okay, humour me while I think out loud here. Say for instance that bounds of the warp are tied to an individual galaxy, or that each galaxy is akin to an empire in the warp where different gods and different laws possibly hold sway. As a result, the engineered orcs, when they were created by the old ones, were given the power of the Wa to act as a power boost, a non-sentient hive mind of sorts that reflected with their thoughts to create Gork and Mork in a manner akin to the Chaos Gods, or perhaps the Emperor depending on how you think about it. But when the Tyranids evolved, or were engineered depending on how they came to be, they were given a true hive mind that bound their intellects together. But as this was a psychic connection, it affected the warp too in a different way, creating the hive mind we see today. Or, if we go back to the theory and postulate that the warp has boundaries based on universal geography, maybe there was no warp in that galaxy for the hive mind to affect at the time, but their arrival in the Milky Way, and thus playing by the new rules of the Immaterium, caused a shadow in the warp we see today. Hard to say, more data required. Apologies, I got a little carried away there, but I hope you can see some of the fascinating possibilities that the hive mind creates about the Tyranids, the warp, and even other species in the Materium. None of it may be true and we'll likely never know, but it's an interesting thought experiment nonetheless. However, I did mention one very important aspect in that rambling that we can define about the hive mind: the shadow in the warp. Any survivors of a Tyranid invasion drawn from a psychic race will know about the shadow in the warp. Whilst the name is something of a misnomer for the effects, it seems appropriate enough for our purposes. As a Tyranid Hive Fleet draws closer to a target world or system, a light-years-wide warp distortion is emitted around it. In fact, it's emitted all the time, but we don't notice until it gets close to inhabited space. With the system now left isolated from its peers, it is much easier for the Tyranids to consume as reinforcements cannot be summoned. Astropathic choirs cannot transmit, ships cannot enter or leave via warp travel, and the whole region is put into a communications blackout. It also means that a greater amount of biomass can be consumed since the prey cannot run away. The shadow in the warp ranges far ahead of the Hive Fleets as mentioned, and I assume that that's where its name comes from. It is as if the hive mind has cast its own shadow over the Immaterium's natural disorder, if you will, smothering those within to leave them vulnerable and alone. This effect is actually amplified in those with psychic potential, as the shadow in the warp also has similar effects to the newly established region of space known as the Pariah Nexus, though albeit via vastly different means. Those under the shadow feel a malignant fear of sorts, amplified much more in those with psychic abilities, where it manifests in a manner more akin to terror. Even attempting to harness the warp under the shadow can be deadly to body and mind, and more than a few psychers have gone insane from the effort without much real success. Again, this softens up the prey of the Hive Fleet before it arrives, even if a Genestealer cult isn't already there to sow further havoc and discord. What is less clear is the exact nature of the shadow in the warp. How does it occur? Is it a conscious adaptation or merely a side effect of the Tyranid species? The current working theory is actually the latter of these ideas. The shadow is not created by the hive mind, but it is there because of the hive nature of the Tyranids. As mentioned previously, the hive mind is constantly receiving data from all Tyranids via psychic feedback, and the theory posits that the sheer volume of psychic communication in a hive fleet creates the shadow as a byproduct. Whilst the sentience of the hive mind is unclear and unknown, given that none save perhaps Varotagurians have contacted it and lived, it would not surprise me if the shadow has not always been there. Instead, it was evolved or enhanced in some way as the Tyranids fought and consumed more and more psychic races in whatever galaxy they probably came from. Possibly, if you believe that the Tyranids are fleeing from something even worse, you could argue that the shadow was actually a defensive mechanism, designed to prevent a psychic threat from pursuing them effectively. Whatever its origins, the shadow in the warp is the closest we have to seeing the hive mind at work, though of course its effects are felt whenever the Tyranids fight. Domineering and powerful as the hive mind is, it does not have unlimited reach or control. The shadow in the warp may be far-reaching, but the actual transmission range of commands appears to be much shorter. This means that the hive mind requires synaptic conduits to continue exerting control over a planet-side swarm. The primary conduit for a fleet is known as the Norn Queen, but as that never goes planet-side due to the risk, it usually falls to the various synapse creatures such as Hive Tyrants, Tyranid Warriors, Trigon Primes, and many others. These organisms are designed to amplify and project the hive mind's will, if you like, and it is through their influence that the lesser Tyranids remain on task throughout the invasion and consumption of a world. Without the presence of synapse creatures, the influence of the hive mind is lost or at least diminished, causing the non-synapse organisms to revert back to their instinctive behaviour, which suggests a limited sentience for a single Tyranid, which you might actually expect in a species that works with a hive mind. One last thing to note regarding the hive mind and the warp: the cicatrix maledictum. When the maledictum truly began to form, the Tyranid Hive Fleet Leviathan was deep into an invasion of the Blood Angels' homeworld of Baal. Arguably, they had the campaign won, despite the combined efforts of the temporary 9th Legion reunion. But when the maledictum truly opened and the bloodthirster Kabanda emerged, the Tyranids began to scream as if in pain. We believe that the hive mind had been cut off for Leviathan, and the organisms it controlled were truly alone, with only their own synapse creatures to psychically control them, and pretty much failing. Between the demons and the 9th Legion, along with the Indomitus Crusades' arrival, the forces of Leviathan were slaughtered. What this tells us about the relationship between the warp and the hive mind is difficult to clarify. The maledictum cut off Leviathan, implying that even its Norn Queen was isolated, and perhaps the empiric feedback of such a rift forming led to a psychic backlash that caused the agony among the organisms. We can't be truly sure of much, but if the warp can affect the power of the hive mind like that, maybe that earlier classification or theoretical classification of it as a sentient warp entity of some kind is less correct than we posited earlier. We can't really be sure what the hive mind is. As I say, there's only one person who's theorized to have touched it and lived, but more to ponder. And there you have it. What insight we have been able to glean on the Tyranid hive mind. This vast, incomprehensible intelligence has coordinated the consumption of innumerable worlds, directing an entire species via psychic and synaptic dominion. What it truly is may never be clarified, but every scrap of knowledge we collect may be fundamental to defeating the Tyranids before the galaxy is consumed entirely. For now, however, we must move on. Next time, probably a rather long story that builds from one of our Legion's logs. Whilst their leader was and will be again a topic unto themselves, their mark on human history, especially for the Astartes, cannot be denied. Thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.